Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of the guns that they are going to be selling in their upcoming September of 2017 premiere auction. Today, we're taking a look at a Reising Model 60 not quite submachine gun. Now, the Reising Models 50 and 55 were 45 caliber submachine guns that were used by the U.S. military, primarily the U.S. Marine Corps, and they kind of got themselves a bad reputation, but not really one that they totally deserved. Now, I have a separate video on a Model 55 Reising, so if you're interested specifically in the submachine gun, check that video out. But what we're looking at today is the semi-automatic-only version. Now, this isn't something that they just dropped onto the market recently to try and grab a piece of commercial sale. What we're looking at today, though, is specifically the Model 60 semi-automatic-only version of the Reising. Now, this was actually made at the exact same time as the 50 and the 55, the submachine guns. Reising figured that there was part of their market that was specifically interested in a gun that wasn't necessarily fully automatic. Part of this was for the non-military market. The National Firearms Act, the registration of machine guns, really did make it simpler to sell a semi-automatic rifle instead. And they were looking for sales for example, security guards at banks or power plant security guards, the sorts of people where they weren't necessarily expecting to be attacked by, a company of Fallschirmjäger. They were worried about, well, if there's no one guarding the place, someone might walk in and steal something. So that guy doesn't need a submachine gun, he just needs some sort of firearm. And one of H&R's marketing points was that a carbine like this, a semi-automatic rifle, was a much more accurate weapon than a handgun. It's much easier to shoot precisely, especially at long range, with a long gun than it is with a handgun. So, maybe this is a better option for your guard than just a pistol. And of course, having a long gun looks more intimidating than a pistol as well, so maybe you'll be even better off. You'll scare people away without ever having to use the thing. Now, mechanically, what's kind of cool is that this is exactly the same as the full auto Reisings, just without the full auto selective fire capability. The Reising was a closed bolt gun from the very beginning, unlike, for example, the Thompson, which was an open bolt gun, and the semi-auto versions today have to be modified and changed to closed bolt. The Reising's closed bolt functionality was another one of its marketing points. The idea was, since the bolt's already closed when you fire, it's again much easier to shoot accurately. You don't have this weight of bolt slamming forward in between when you pull the trigger and when the gun actually fires, as you would in an open bolt gun. So Reising had a number of actually pretty legitimate good points. The Reising is also about half the weight of a Thompson. It was less than half the cost of a Thompson. It really was a very effective competitor to the Thompson gun in everything except popular dramatic appeal, because you don't really look like a prohibition gangster with a Reising gun. But when it comes down to the things that matter, the Reising works as well or often better than the Thompson does. All right, before we take this apart, there's one other thing that I do want to point out, and that is the one other distinguishing or differentiating feature between this and the submachine gun versions of the Reising, and that's the barrel. This has an 18¼ inch barrel, which is a bit long. Now, Reising played that up in their marketing. They also, if you look at their marketing documents, they say the Model 60 has a 400-yard effective range because it does have a substantially longer barrel than the submachine guns. However, the reason for 18½ instead of 16, as we would typically see today on something like this, is that when these were produced, the National Firearms Act actually had a minimum barrel length of 18 inches for both rifles and shotguns. So in order to market this as a weapon not subject to the NFA for the commercial market, Reising had to give it at least an 18-inch barrel. So that's what they did. Now, let's take this thing apart. The markings on the Reising are here on top of the action. You'll notice this is a Model 60. All of the 60s are semi-automatic carbines. The submachine guns were 50 and 55. Caliber 45. This uses standard 45 ACP ammunition, and it was manufactured by Harrington and Richardson. The serial number on this one is 2659. A grand total of 3,248 of these guns were made between 1943 and 1949. So that's really a remarkably small number. I think smaller than a lot of people realize, especially in comparison to the full auto Reisings, which numbered over 110,000. The controls here are basically identical to the submachine guns, with the exception of there being no full auto selector position. So we have semi-automatic and safe, and then we have the same style of rear sight. This is an aperture sight, which is kind of cool. And on the Model 60, with its long barrel, it has quite the long sight radius. This would legitimately be a quite accurate gun to shoot. The one bit of real weirdness about the Reising as a gun for shooting is the charging handle, which is located up here inside the stock in front of the barrel. This is the operating rod of the gun. You'll see that in a moment. So charging it, you're literally just charging the operating rod manually. So you pull back on that, and it cycles the bolt for you. And the last control here is the magazine catch, which you have to reach under and pull away from the gun. That prevents it from ever being released accidentally. Once you do that, you can drop out the magazine. Standard magazine was 20 rounds. They did have some trouble with durability of the feed lips. As you can see, those are kind of thin up there. Unfortunately, their solution to that was to make a 12-round single stack magazine with reinforced feed lips, and some of the guns were actually made with a ribbed magazine well that could only accept the 12-round magazines. That's not a great solution. However, as long as you don't treat your magazines badly, they'll work just fine. The Model 60 Reisings are almost entirely smooth-barreled. The submachine guns and some of the commercial guns would have one of a couple different styles of cooling ribs on the barrel, but not the semi-auto 60s. It wasn't deemed necessary for the semi-automatic. And the Model 60 has just a plain front sight here. Again, the Model 50 submachine guns had a compensator. There are a few Model 60s out there that do as well, but it's not typically found that way. Disassembly takes a little bit of getting used to on these guns, but it starts easily enough. Take this screw and loosen it. The screw won't come all the way out. It's captive in the stock, so just loosen it up, and then you can pull the stock off of the action. Now we've got this batch of parts. There's nothing else you have to do up there. Next step for disassembly is to remove these two pins, which hold the magazine well in place. These, in theory, should have some tension to them. You can see that they're bent like this. That's deliberate. And as I said, they're supposed to hold some spring tension to keep this locked in place. Now, they can't go anywhere as long as the stock's on, because they can't slide out, but these two have no spring tension at all and pretty much fall out once you take the stock off. Once those pins are gone, then you can pull off the magazine well. Next step is to unscrew the rear end cap of the receiver. That has a little spring-loaded detent to keep it from unwinding when you don't want it to. When this comes out, we have a guide rod, and this is actually the hammer. It's a linear hammer, and I'll show you that in just a moment. This next step is sort of one of the things that's indicative of why the military had some issues with the Reising in a way that a civilian gun really doesn't. So the next step in disassembly is to pull the charging handle back until you can see this little hole in the mainspring guide rod, and then you use a punch in that hole to hold the mainspring fully compressed. That's really not a good military firearms disassembly solution. But for a civilian gun or a police gun, you know what, that works just fine. So once you've got this locked in place, then we can pull the operating rod up and off of the gun. Very important, don't let that punch come out, or else the guide rod here will go flying across the room. And lastly, we have to take the bolt out. So what you want to do is just pull the trigger, which gets the sear out of the way, and then you can just, in theory, push it out. There we go. Out the back of the receiver. So there are all of the working bits of a Model 60 Reising, which is mechanically identical to a 55 or a Model 50 Reising. Now, I want to take a quick look at this hammer to show you how that actually works, because it's a bit unorthodox. But first, I have to explain how the Reising actually works. It's able to have this very small and lightweight bolt because it's not a simple blowback gun. It's actually delayed blowback. The way that operates is the bolt actually locks up into the roof of the receiver every time before it fires. Or rather, it doesn't lock, but it lifts up into the top of the receiver. You can see right there, there's a recess cut in the top of the receiver, and the top of the bolt here is curved. And so this is delayed blowback, because when you start pushing on this bolt, like the pressure from firing would, what it does is it first has to operate on this angled surface between the receiver and the bolt, and push the bolt down, and then it can cycle it backwards. And the delay from that happening is just enough to make this to let the bullet travel some, reduce the pressure in the barrel, and reduce the velocity with which the bolt's going to start going backwards, so that it operates safely. Now, knowing how this is actually operating, we can take a look at the hammer and understand how it works. There's a firing pin centered in the middle of the bolt, makes it nice and easy to produce. When that goes forward, the firing pin protrudes, and it is spring-loaded. So if the bolt is sitting here in the center of the receiver, and this hammer comes forward, this hole in the middle of the hammer is going to line up perfectly with the firing pin, just like that, and it won't fire. The only time it can fire is when the bolt has actually lifted up into its recess in the top of the receiver. The hammer is still traveling centered in the receiver, and when it hits then, it will actually depress the firing pin, which show you like that, and presto, the gun fires. So this does several things simultaneously. This hammer is very easy to manufacture. You've got your sear engagement here on the hammer, or striker if you prefer. Typically the hammer is a piece that actually hits the firing pin. The striker is a moving piece that is the firing pin. So I think the technical argument would be that this is a linear hammer. At any rate, if the bolt's not in battery, the gun can't fire. It'll just hit like this, hole centered on the firing pin, and nothing happens. Once the bolt is in battery, then it can fire. And of course, when the bolt goes into battery, it is of course being held by this hook on the operating rod in that recess in the bolt. So when it loads around, the bolt goes forward, locks into the chamber, and it's all ready to fire. When you pull the trigger, what you're actually releasing is this linear hammer, which moves forward under pressure of its own spring, hits the firing pin, and fires. More than half of the total Reising Model 60 production was actually purchased during World War II, so I would suspect probably almost all of the production up to that point, by the DSC, the Defense Supply Corporation. This was an organization that was set up basically to organize the distribution of war-important sorts of material, like firearms. There were restrictions on commercial sale of new firearms because, of course, the government wanted firearms production to be oriented towards supplying military needs. So being able to go out and buy guns for a purpose that was relevant to the war effort but not directly military, that was something that was kind of difficult, and that's what the DSC was set up to do. So the Reising M60s tended to be used by primarily railway guards, factory guards, and police officers. These are all people who really have a legitimate need for a firearm, but they're not part of the military. There were a bunch of other federal agencies, state police departments, all those sorts of end users who needed guns but weren't going to get them from the military, and once the war was really going, couldn't really get them commercially. So they'd buy them through the DSC. So in this way, the Model 60 Reisings really did play a significant, if not very glamorous, role in the war by equipping guys who needed guns but weren't actually in the fighting military. If you're one of those people who wants to get as close as you can to the experience of using a legitimate military submachine gun or carbine, and you don't want to go through the hurdles of National Firearms Act registration and the cost of a real machine gun, I think the Reising Model 60 is a vastly overlooked option, because not only is this everything that a semi-automatic Thompson gun is, I think it fits the barrel length better. It's much lighter. It's a gun that was actually manufactured in this time period. These were all manufactured between 43 and 49, where the semi-auto Thompsons, with the exception of the small number of 1927 semi-autos that they tried to sell and didn't do very well with, most of those guns are modern recreations. This is an original H&R gun. It actually, I don't know about this particular one, but a lot of these were actually made during the war. The ones that weren't were made immediately after the war. And it was literally a part of the US war effort in World War II. And so it's got all of that historical authenticity to it. It's the exact same action. And shooting one of these is a much closer approximation of a submachine gun, full auto ricing, than a semi-auto Thompson is to a real Thompson, because these guns were closed bolt in all cases. So you don't have a conversion before the gun can be sold without going through the NFA. This is a closed bolt semi-auto carbine version of a closed bolt submachine gun. So I think a lot of people don't realize that these exist, and people who do think, you know, it's just some knockoff thing of the submachine gun. Well, no, these have a very substantial place in history, and they're really quite accessible on the civilian market. The downside, of course, is there aren't very many of them, as we discussed. So if you've been looking for something like this, if you're like me and you don't really like the Thompson submachine gun and want something that's cooler, you know, something that's got better history to it and is also a better shooting gun, well, here's your chance. This, and I believe there are actually one or two other Model 60 Thompsons coming up for sale in this auction at Rock Island. So if you take a look at the description text below the video, you'll find a link to the catalog page for this particular one. That will give you their pictures, their description, their price estimates, and all of the other information you might want on it. If you do some searching through the catalog, I believe you can find another one or two examples. And then if you decide you just really would like to have one, you can place a bid on them through the website, over the phone, or participating live here at the auction. Thanks for watching.